Hey gang! Welcome back to the Silver River Art Studio for the 2024 edition of my annual Crocheted Snowflake. I'm really excited about this year's project because it's based on one of the first snowflakes ever. Okay, not actually one of the first snowflakes ever, but one of the first snowflakes ever photographed. Back in January of 1885, Wilson Bentley became the first person to ever have photographed an individual snowflake, and over the next 46 years, he'd go on to photograph more than 5,300 of them. You've heard that no two snowflakes are alike? Well, we have Wilson Bentley to thank for that. In 1898, Bentley published the first snowflake photos the world had ever seen in the magazine Popular Science, which is still around. And later, he described how he did it. He'd catch them on a blackboard and use a magnifying glass to choose the ones he wanted to photograph, being very careful not to breathe on them. Then he used a wooden splinter to pick up the snowflake and put it on a glass microscope slide, and then pressed it flat using a feather. All of this while wearing gloves so the heat from his hands wouldn't melt the snowflakes. He'd put the glass slide on an ordinary microscope to which he'd attached a bellows camera and focused it. But in those days, the cameras were so big that he couldn't reach the focusing screw on the microscope. So he had to run a cord from the focusing screw to a wooden wheel in order to be able to focus it. He would then uncover the lens of the camera for anywhere from 8 seconds to more than 100 and cover it again. Once he had developed the glass plates, that was only the beginning. He said, the photographer discovers that the body of the snow crystal is so transparent that it does not contrast enough with its background to make a print in which the form will stand out. There is no purely photographic method for producing the white images against a black background. No Photoshop in those days. The only effective method is to hold the negative so that the image is illuminated, and then with an etching knife or other fine, sharp-pointed tool to scrape away the emulsion around the outline of the crystal to leave it standing alone against a background. With a certain amount of understatement, he adds, this requires considerable patience and often considerable time as well. Imagine going through that whole process more than 5,300 times. And in spite of living in Vermont, he said that it rarely happens that during a single winter, there are more than a dozen good opportunities for securing complete crystals, and there may not be half so many. And, just in case you decide to take up photographing snowflakes, he said that the greater number of perfect crystals is found in widespread storms or blizzards. And he found that the same storm will produce similar shapes of flakes. He also discovered that small, compact crystals come from higher, colder clouds, and that the fancy multi-branch snowflakes form in the lower, warmer clouds. So, the next time you catch a snowflake on your glove, you'll be able to tell how far it fell. Compared to photographing snowflakes, crocheting them is easy. But there are so many snowflake patterns out there that coming up with an original one is hard. Last year, I created a snowflake pattern that was specifically designed to teach complete, total, absolute beginners who'd never crocheted before how to make a snowflake. You can find that tutorial here, and the pattern is available on my website. You can find a link to that in the description down below. Snowflakes make wonderful gifts for the holiday season, no matter what holiday you're celebrating, whether it be Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, or even, for my Kiwi friends, Matariki, the Maori New Year. At the end of this video, I'll not only show you how to stiffen your snowflake with sugar, I'll also show you how to turn it into a card that doubles as an ornament. This year, I chose to replicate one of the snowflakes from that very first 1898 magazine article. Here it is. And here's my replica, both before and after I starched it with sugar. You can find the free pattern for this snowflake, as well as for last year's, on my website at silverriverarts.com/freebies. As I did last year, in this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how to crochet my 2024 snowflake, which has a couple of little original curveballs, such as some upside-down picots. As I did last year, I'll do the tutorial using worsted weight yarn, so it's easier to follow what I'm doing. This isn't a particularly hard pattern, but it isn't a good one for beginners. So if you're brand new to crocheting, I encourage you to check out last year's tutorial and start there. First, let's talk about the materials you're going to need for this project. You'll need a cotton crochet thread or crochet yarn. That's because you'll need something that will really absorb the sugar water when we go to stiffen your snowflake. You'll also need a suitable crochet hook. One tip for this project: this is a fairly visually dense pattern, so you may want to use a larger hook than you would normally use to give it the light and airy feeling of a snowflake. Here you can see different snowflakes that I made using the same crochet thread, but different sizes of hooks. Larger hooks make for a more delicate and airy snowflake, whereas smaller ones make for one with a little more visual heft, closer to the original photograph. You'll also need a pair of scissors and a tapestry needle or other needle with an eye large enough to accommodate your crochet thread. If you want to hang your snowflake as an ornament, you'll need some clear monofilament thread and a needle with a finer eye. I provided links to supplies in the description box down below. To stiffen your snowflake, you'll need boiling water, sugar, a small bowl, a small whisk or a fork, a spoon, and some straight pins. Make sure that the pins are stainless steel or nickel-coated steel because you don't want rust spots on your snowflake. You'll also need a piece of waxed paper and a piece of cardboard or a cardboard box. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, it's just to pin your snowflake into whilst it dries. I do find that a cardboard box works a little easier than a plain piece of cardboard. If you decide to attach your snowflake to a card, then you'll need whatever you'll use to make the card and a little bit of Scotch tape. Just a reminder before we start, don't forget to make sure that your hands are free of any lotion or anything like that before you start your project. You don't want any of that on your snowflake. As I mentioned before, I recommend that you use a larger hook than you normally would due to the density of the stitches in this pattern. You may want to swatch with a few different sized hooks before you start the project. As we go along, I'll show you how I develop this pattern. Then you can use that as a basis to design your very own snowflakes. Most crocheted snowflakes, and indeed most circular crochet projects, start out with a ring made from chain stitches at the beginning. That makes a little hole in the center. But if you look at our snowflake here, it doesn't have a hole in the center. It's just a series of 6 spokes radiating out from the center point. So instead, we're going to start our snowflake using a magic ring. If you haven't used a magic ring to start before, I'll walk you through it. If you are a lefty, you may find it helpful to hop on over to my 2-minute YouTube tips and tricks video, where I'll show you how to flip the video so you can watch it in mirror image, which may make it easier to follow. I've linked that video up above and down in the description box down below. I'll slow down this part so you can see clearly what I'm doing. Start by wrapping your yarn around the first 2 fingers of your left hand, right hand for lefties of course. Note a couple of things here. The first is that the tail of the yarn is facing downward on the inside of your hand. Also note that we formed an X here, and that's important. We're going to stick our hook under the upper right hand arm of the X and up in between the arms. Here's the tricky part. Snag the upper left hand arm with your hook and pull it under the right hand arm. Now grab hold of the yarn where the cross of the X was, and that will form a loop. I'm going to go back and show you that again. Tail of the yarn down, wrap around, form the X, under the right hand arm, up between the arms, grab the left hand arm, pull it under the right hand arm, and grab the cross. Okay, we're back to where we left off. We'll start the first row by chaining 4. Before we go on to the rest of this row, take a moment to make sure that you're headed in the right direction. As we do double crochets in the magic ring, we want to make sure that we are crocheting in the same direction as the tail goes. We'll do a double crochet followed by 2 chain stitches, and we'll repeat that 5 times. I'll catch up with you then and show you what to do with the magic ring. We can see the tail of our magic ring here, and so we're going to just pull that tight. You'll notice here the difference between using the magic ring versus using the usual ring made from chain stitches. This matches the center of our original snowflake, as you can see here. And now we'll just finish up this row with a slip stitch in the loop we made with the chain 4. So let's take a look at our original snowflake and what we'll be doing in our next row. You can see here that we wind up with some little crescent-shaped forms all the way around the center. So we're going to replicate that. In this image, I'm showing you our snowflake before we stiffen it because it will look more like what you see developing in your hands. To create that crescent shape, we're going to decrease and then increase the height of our stitches. So we'll do a double crochet, a single crochet, a slip stitch, another single crochet, and another double crochet, all in the same loop. Then we'll do a single chain stitch before we jump to our next loop. In most cases, we use a chain 2 to be equivalent to a double crochet. But in this case, I've found that a chain 3 works better. So that's what we'll do here. We'll start with a chain 3. Then we'll do that single crochet, slip stitch, single crochet, double crochet, chain 1 series. Then in our next loop, we'll do the double, single, slip, single, double, chain 1 pattern all the way around. And I'll catch up with you once we get there. Okay, we have most of row 2 done. We'll just finish up with a slip stitch in the chain 3 to finish the row. So let's take a look at what we're going to be doing in row 3. Once again, we can see on the original snowflake that we have these little loops. And then in between them, we have these little arcs with a sort of blobby bit pointing down. Those are those curveball downward picots I mentioned, but don't worry, I'll walk you through them. There are also some other little twiddly bits on the original snowflake that we aren't going to try and reproduce at this scale. So we'll start out by making the arcs with the downward picot. But first I want to review with you quickly how we do a normal picot so you can see where the difference lies. I'm going to do it here with much larger yarn so you can see the detail. I have 6 chain stitches here. Let's start by taking a moment to look at the stitch architecture, since it will make what I'm doing make much more sense. This is the top side, and you can see how it forms a series of little V's. If we flip it over, on the bottom side we have a series of little bumps that run down the middle. So I have 6 chain stitches here. For a normal picot, we would go back to stitch 4 of our chain to put our hook through the bottom of that stitch under that little bump, and then we do a slip stitch. Then we do 3 more stitches, and you can see our normal picot that sticks up from the top of the chain. Okay, let's do our downward picot. It's a little tricky, so I find it helpful to chain 3, then grab the chain right behind the hook, and then chain 3 more for my chain 6. Keep hanging onto the chain where you grabbed it. Once again, we'll go through the 4th chain in this series. It'll be just above your thumb. You want to go through both arms of the V of that stitch. Here you can see the V, and through the space between the arms of the V, you can see the hook. Once again, we do a slip stitch here. Now comes a tricky bit. With a normal picot, it sticks up and is out of the way of the yarn for the next stitch, but in the downward picot, it gets in the way. We could go in front of the picot, but that would give it a weird twist. So we're going to bring the yarn around behind the picot in order to take our next stitch. Hold on to the picot with your other hand, which will help to keep everything nice and snug. Then go ahead and do your remaining chain stitches. If you didn't quite catch that, I'm going to do it again on the actual snowflake so you'll get a chance to see it again. I'll start row 3 with a chain 6, then a downward facing picot. Remember what I said about chain 3, grab the chain 3 more. Hook under the V of the 4th stitch. Do a slip stitch. Yarn behind the picot, hold the picot, and chain 3 more. You got it! We're going to do a slip stitch in that chain 1 from the previous row, and then chain 5 to make a big loop, and then a slip stitch in the same chain 1. And we're going to do that whole sequence 5 more times for a total of 6. And I'll catch you up when we get there. But before we do that, I'll show you that downward picot one more time. We're ready for row 4, so let's refer back to our original snowflake to see what we'll be up to in this row. Once again, it's pretty complex, so we're going to break it down. First, we have these little arcs that go from loop to loop, so we'll do that as a chain stitch, easy. But we can also see that there is a sort of an inverted V shape. In the original, it looks more like a capital A that comes down and sort of hugs either side of our downward picot. So we're going to do those with double crochets. But either side of those, we also have these little loops that seem to come off the chain 5 loops that we made in the previous row. So we'll make a couple more chain stitches there. They seem to have a little bit more substantial attachment there than we had in the previous row. So instead of attaching them with a slip stitch, we're going to use a single crochet. And here you can see the same layout overlaid on our crocheted version. Okay, let's get started on row 4. At this point, you'll notice that some of your downward picots may have flipped up a bit. That's fine, we're going to sort that out now. We actually want to start this row right in front of the picot, but we have to get there first. So we're going to do 3 slip stitches around that chain in the row below. Doing a series of slip stitches around the chain this way has a couple of little tricks to it, because you want to make the slip stitches as invisible as possible. The first slip stitch is just normal. Under the chain, pull the loop through. The second slip stitch, we're going to go over the chain stitch to the back and pull the loop through from there. The third slip stitch is just like the first. That gives you a nice, snug, invisible series of slip stitches that gets you to the next picot. Now we're going to chain 2 in lieu of a double crochet. This is where we're going to sort out our picot. Flip your picot down and hold it while you do your 2 chain stitches, and then do a double crochet that comes down on the other side of the picot. Continue to hold that picot down. That forms our upside down V bracketing the picot and helping to hold it in place. Now it's simple. Chain 3, then single crochet in the chain 5 loop of the previous row. Now we're going to do that little hop that is on top of the bigger loop. So we're going to chain 2 and then do another single crochet in the chain 5 loop. Now we're going to do a chain 3, and then we're going to do a double crochet just in front of the picot. And that takes the place of the chain 2 that we did the first time. And then we're going to do a double crochet that comes down on the other side of the picot. And that forms our little inverted V shape. And we'll keep going like that, and I will catch up with you at the end. Okay, we're ready to finish row 4. We're going to do a slip stitch into the double crochet, not into the chain 2. You'll see how that plays into the pattern in a moment. Once you have the slip stitch in, it should look like this. Think of it as forming a capital A. Remember that capital A because it'll come up again in row 5. Let's look back at our original snowflake again. We have another series of arcs here, forming a sort of petal shape. You'll also note where they touch, right at the top of those little inverted V's. And the little spokes to each arc radiate out from that little hop that we did with the chain 2 in the previous row. And here we can see that same layout in our finished snowflake. Row 5 is simple. We're going to chain 2 and then do a double crochet followed by a chain in the little hop that we made in the chain 2. Then we repeat that double crochet, chain 1 4 more times in that same loop for a total of 5 double crochets. It looks like half of a wagon wheel with 5 spokes. Then we'll do one more chain stitch so we're even on both sides of that motif. And now we'll do a slip stitch in the second double crochet, not the first. This is where we form another A shape. Check this. If you've done the slip stitch in the first double crochet, it won't form an A. Then repeat that whole sequence 5 more times, and we'll be ready to finish up the row. Catch up with you then. Okay, we're back here to finish up row 5. We're going to add one more chain stitch again. Remember, we want 2 on either side of our A. Now here's the sticky part. We want to go right back through the top part of that first A again. So this slip stitch will be in the very same space as the previous one. And on to row 6. Back at our original snowflake, we see a similar wheel and spokes pattern, but with a couple of little twists. Some of the spokes are wider than others, which reflects what we see in the original. We also have a little swoop between each of the wheels to connect them. And here we have the crocheted version of the snowflake. First, we need to get to a different place on the snowflake. So we're going to do a couple of slip stitches in that chain 2 to get there. The pattern from this point may seem a bit confusing at first, but once we get through the first repeat, it'll be clear and make sense. As with before, the first slip stitch is normal, and then we do the second one going up over the top. Then we'll do another slip stitch into the first double crochet on that row below. This is an important step, so don't forget it. This will make it look as though the spoke is a continuation of that same line. Next, we're going to chain 4. The second spoke will be thicker, so we're going to do 3 double crochets in the next spoke. Then we'll chain 1 and do a double crochet in the middle spoke. Then we'll do that chain 1 double crochet twice more in that same middle spoke. That way you'll look like you've got 3 spokes coming out of that middle double crochet. We'll do another chain stitch and then jump to the next spoke and do 3 double crochets in that one. Chain 1 again and double crochet in the last spoke. And now we can see the pattern beginning to form. We have the 5 spokes in the row below. In the first one we have a single spoke, then 3 triple spokes, 3 separate spokes, triple spoke again, and 1 more spoke. We'll chain 2, and that'll get us to the next wagon wheel. We'll do a double crochet in the first spoke, and then chain 1. That brings us back to our first thick spoke with 3 double crochets. We'll repeat this sequence 5 more times, and I'll catch up with you as we finish off this row. And we'll finish up with a slip stitch in the chain 4 that we began with, and we're on our final row. So once again, we come back to our original snowflake. Just as we see here, this row and the last row are very similar, so how we execute them will be similar too. We have the same pattern of 3 spokes in the middle spoke of each lobe of the snowflake, flanked by a wide spoke of double crochets and then a chain 4 in each corner. The primary difference between row 6 and row 7 is that on row 6, the lobes or petals of the snowflakes were linked directly together by chain stitches, whereas in this row they're completely separate. We'll navigate between the petals using slip stitches. This may seem fiddly, but it goes quite quickly, and it also provides some extra definition to the outside of our snowflake. In this row, we want to have our chain 4 come straight up out of the double crochet in the previous row. So we'll start by doing 1 more slip stitch to get over to that cluster of 3 double crochets that we did. And then we'll do another slip stitch in the first double crochet, and then we'll chain 4. Then we're going to skip the second double crochet in the cluster and do 2 double crochets in the third stitch of the cluster. We'll also do 2 double crochets in the chain 1. And then we'll chain 1. Then we'll do a double crochet followed by a single chain stitch 3 times into the middle one of the spokes in the row below. Then 2 double crochets in the chain 1 in the row below, and 2 double crochets in the first double crochet of the row below. Chain 4 and then do a slip stitch into the third double crochet in that cluster. Now we can see the pattern starting to take form. We're going to work our way over to the next petal with a series of slip stitches. Slip stitch in the chain 1, slip stitch in the double crochet, then 2 slip stitches in the chain 2. Remember, when we work more than 1 slip stitch into the same chain, we work the first one in the front and the second one in the back. Then another into the double crochet, 1 into the chain 1, and we're back to the beginning. So we'll do a double crochet in the first double crochet of the cluster and chain 4 and so on. And I'll catch up with you at the end. Once you get back to the beginning, cut off your yarn, leaving a tail, and pull it through. Then just use your tapestry needle to sew in the loose ends and trim them off close to your snowflake. Okay, let's get started on the next step, stiffening our snowflake with sugar. Why sugar? Why not starch or hairspray? Some folks recommend them, but both of them will discolor over time, and they may not make your snowflake stiff enough. Sugar won't discolor either. We'll need our snowflake, and we'll need boiling water, sugar, a small dish, a spoon or a measuring spoon, a small whisk or a fork, and a cardboard box. You'll also need pins and a piece of wax paper. You'll also want a damp cloth nearby to wipe your fingers with. This can be a bit of a sticky proposition. Just a reminder again here, make sure that your hands are free from any lotion, etc., so it doesn't transfer to your snowflake. First, we'll put a little bit of boiling water in the bowl. We don't need very much. You don't want to use a lot of water because you don't want to waste sugar. It should be boiling hot so that the sugar dissolves more quickly. Now the sugar. How much? That's probably a good start. And then you take a whisk and just stir it around until you don't see any more sugar crystals. You may find that you need to add more sugar. This is not an exact science, but you do want the water to absorb as much sugar as it can hold. You may see a few undissolved crystals in the bottom, and that's a good clue. The good news is that once it's dried, if your snowflake doesn't seem stiff enough, you can always redo it with a little more sugar. For that reason, it's a good idea to hang on to your sugar water until your snowflake has dried and you're happy with it. You can always warm up the water again in the microwave and add a bit more sugar. So this is looking pretty good. Most of my sugar has dissolved, but there are still a few little crystals in there, which shows that it's fairly saturated with sugar. Our next step is that you're going to take your piece of wax paper and fold it in half. Then you're going to fold it in thirds. Give it a good crease. That gives you a nice 6-pointed star that will help you lay out your snowflake evenly. Lay the piece of wax paper down on the cardboard box. Now take the snowflake and dip it in the sugar water a couple of times and wringing it out in between. That makes sure that the sugar water gets all through the fibers. Then wring it out. Put a pin through the middle of the snowflake and then through the middle of the creases on your waxed paper. Now stretch out the points of your snowflake and pin them into the 6 creases on your waxed paper, starting with 2 points that are opposite to each other. Then pick another opposite pair and pin those. And finally the last 2. Make sure that the points are all roughly the same length. You may have to pull one a little more tightly or loosen up another one a bit in order to make them match. Then start with the sides of each petal. And finally make sure you pin each one of those downward picots in the right direction. Here you can see the pin placement. Feel free to use extra pins to sort out any little bits that seem ski-wumpus. And there's our snowflake. All we have to do now is let it dry. How long depends on where you live and the ambient humidity, but I find that overnight is good. If you try to unpin it too soon, you'll find that it's still a little sticky. Don't forget to wash your pins after you take them out. You don't want to get your next project all sticky. To hang your ornament, you'll just need a piece of monofilament thread. If you want to turn your snowflakes into cards, start by designing your card. It can be as simple or as fancy as you'd like. Position your snowflake on the card where you want it, and then use a pin to poke a hole through at the top and the bottom. Don't forget to open up the card before you poke your holes, so you won't wind up with a hole through both layers. Cut off a piece of monofilament thread. You want it twice as long as you need to hang the ornament. Too long is better than too short, since you can always trim it, so start with 6 or 7 inches. Thread one end of the thread through your smaller needle, then thread it through the top of your snowflake. Thread the other end of the thread through the needle again, so you now have both ends threaded through the eyes of your needle, and pull them both through the top hole on your card. Remove the needle and tie a knot. Monofilament is pretty slippery, so I find that it works best to line up the two ends and then tie a single overhand knot with both strands, and then tie another overhand knot again. Trim off the end of the monofilament, but not too close to the knot so it doesn't come undone. Pull both pieces of thread tight, winding up the excess around your fingers, and tape it in place inside the card. Now do the same thing at the bottom of your snowflake, but use a shorter piece of thread and tie a couple of knots closer to the surface of the card. This is just to keep the snowflake in place while it's in the envelope. Many of Wilson Bentley's wonderful photographs are available in some great books published by Dover. Nearly half of his total collection can be found in snow crystals, and Dover also has a slightly slimmer version called Snowflakes and Photographs. Both of these are very reasonably priced, at less than $20 US, so I put the links to them down below. These are wonderful inspiration for all kinds of creativity, and even just paging through the photos, I found I'm smiling to myself. These ones made me think of hexagonal quilt blocks. This one, in particular, made me think of those wonderful Hawaiian-style quilts with the elaborate floral appliques. Speaking of flowers, several of them made me think of wildflowers. These are shapes you associate more with spring or summer than with winter. And, of course, if you're going to have flowers, you have to have butterflies. Can you see the 6 little butterflies whirling around the center? The points of this snowflake made me think of the pommel of some elaborate medieval sword, Excalibur, for instance. And speaking of cutlery, the lobes of these ones made me think of the handles of some very fancy silver teaspoons. This one brought to mind a stained glass window with the Star of David in the middle. Here are a couple of what we think of as typical snowflake forms, although since every snowflake is different, there really isn't such a thing as a typical snowflake. And these are just some that I thought were particularly gorgeous. Maybe one of them will turn up next year as my 2025 annual snowflake. We always think of snowflakes as having 6 sides, but I bet you didn't know some of them have 3 sides, and some even have 12. If you'd enjoy learning more about Wilson Snowflake Bentley, I provided some additional links below, including to a delightfully illustrated children's book by Jacqueline Martin and Mary Azarian, which was a Caldecott Children's Book Award winner. It's the perfect gift for any budding young meteorologists you know, or indeed, for anyone who enjoys children's books or loves snowflakes. Before we go, I'd just like to share with you one last snowflake from one of the Dover books that really spoke to me. At first I looked at it and I thought, that's too bad. One of the lobes of that snowflake must have gotten damaged as it fell. Then, looking at it again, I realized that the one point that was different was much more intricate, beautiful, and interesting than the other lobes. I think there's a lesson in that for our lives. Sometimes we go through experiences that we think have damaged us irreparably and that will never be the same. And that may be true. But with time and continued growth, we can become even more interesting and even more beautiful than we might ever have been otherwise. That's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial as much as I did. If so, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe so you won't miss out on the great new videos that I have coming up. And don't forget to skip over to my blog at silverriverarts.com to see what else I've been up to. Catch you next time.